Resilience against stealth ammunition. That's the hot button we're talking about at this virtual sci-fi Times Square fireside. Megan Stifel, Executive Director, Americas at Global Cyber Alliance, brings a wealth of cyber policy experience to this conversation. With roughly 15 days to go before the US election, Americans are wondering, is the US voting system secure? Will every vote count? The US president has spent months suggesting that the election could be rigged and asking supporters to, quote, go into the polls and watch very carefully. Whether it's COVID or binary code of zeros and ones, we're all consumed by how rogue elements infiltrate our bubbles. A warm welcome to our audience. And Megan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon.
Megan, we've been hearing a fresh round of assurances from the highest levels of Homeland Security about the integrity of the US elections. These appear to be aimed at soothing the nerves of voters. This election is made unique by a never-before surge in mail-in ballots. From your vantage point, what are the fears that loom large?
So I think there are probably at least two or three types of fears that we're seeing really manifest and come to a confluence this year in particular. The first, which is one that has been a challenge since the beginning, but is one that actually those who administer elections have a very strong handle on, is the security and confidence of the vote-making system, the process. Are the databases that manage voting information secure? Is the equipment secure? Is the vote tallying process secure? And as you noted, the Department of Homeland Security and three other senior officials in the US government have come out even this week with a lengthy, for them, description of why voters should have confidence in those systems. And I share that confidence. That being said, there are other insecurities that are outside that particular sector that are having an influence on the confidence. And the two that I would identify, the first is how is the media, how are journalists being targeted and covering what's being said, both domestically and driven from external actors. What are those external actors doing to magnify, manipulate, and otherwise try to sow distrust in confidence that is being written about and discussed by the media? And the third piece that I would identify as a real concern this year is obviously the pandemic, and how is that and the process of mail-in ballots, although it falls into the first category of confidence in election systems. How is the pandemic, in many cases, I would argue, being exploited to reduce confidence in that first category, which then can be either further undermined, if you will, by the second category of how is the media being impacted by this, but also can, in other ways, depending on the way the information is covered, actually serve to bring confidence to the first category, which is, of course, I think probably the one we're most concerned about, which is the security of the elections process.
So is the cake baked, or is there something more that can be done to harden systems between now and the election with 15 days to go?
So at this point in time, most of the election systems have been locked down. So the process by which the votes are to the equipment on which votes are cast or tallied, those have been under a technical lockdown for a period of time between 45 to 90 days in most cases. And absent some significant showing, those cannot be further constrained or secured, for lack of a better word. Where I think there is still an opportunity, a significant opportunity for enhanced confidence to be developed within the voting process and the outcome of the election is both by citizens seeking to verify the source behind the information they're receiving. And they can do that in a number of ways. In fact, on its website, DHS has some information about how one unpacks disinformation and how one can spot disinformation. But the other key stakeholder group here are the election administrators themselves, talking about the steps that they have taken to secure the vote, the process by which they can manage expectations that in many cases, I think it's reasonable to expect we will not have a final decision on some of the elections on November 3rd. But assuring voters that that's not for malign purposes and not the result of malicious behavior. Rather, it's actually democracy at work, and that because of the number of mail-in ballots and other precautions that are being taken either by the administrators or by voters themselves due to the pandemic, that in fact it will take time to tally the results, and that is a good thing. That rushes to judgment haven't been made, corners haven't been cut, and that a certain number of actions have been taken to ensure that what has been cast is recorded properly, reported properly, and the outcome has been as the voters wished.
So there's this number that jumped out at me from a recent DHS briefing, that 92% of the votes can be traced back to a paper trail. So then, are we talking about just a tiny sliver that's up in the air?
I would have confidence in what the FBI states. I think, unfortunately, and this goes to the point we were just talking about, there is, I think, an opportunity for elections administrators to support that figure with evidence from their own regions, their own jurisdictions. So that's an impressive figure that we, I think, as Americans kind of can sometimes take for granted. And in some ways, we may not always remember all of the civics lessons and the things that we were taught as elementary and high school students around the way that vote making, the process and the way that votes are cast and tallied in the United States. But it should give voters a significant amount of confidence that the outcome of the election will be exactly as it was intended by them casting their votes. There is legitimate reason to have good confidence, if not great confidence in the elections. It's a long process that has a lot of policies and protections and procedures built into the whole process that in order for someone to have, or a set of someones to have a really significant impact would require a significant amount of work. And I think where we do have to be much more resilient is to not let something that is minor, and it's not to say that someone's vote being miscast is minor, but one blip in the radar in one jurisdiction in a locality does not mean that the entire vote is wrong. We do not have a federal voting, the elections process is set at the state and local level. So what happens in one state doesn't necessarily mean that it happened in another state, and that's a good thing.
FBI and CISA talked about this one concern that relates to the so-called distributed denial of service, or DDoS attacks, where a server gets knocked off, at least temporarily, offline. At what point does that matter to resiliency?
Sure. So the point at which I would anticipate that becoming a largest problem is when votes are being tallied. So when reporting is made from the precinct out into the central ballot collecting venue, so to speak. So in this case, if, for example, the precinct that I'm in it's 7 p.m. The polls have closed, and they are now tallying all the votes from that particular precinct and sending them to, I would assume it's in Columbia. I'm in South Carolina. A malicious actor would, frankly, have to be pretty talented and have to have undertaken a significant amount of preparatory work in order to have to conduct an attack against the precincts in South Carolina, which would essentially result in these attackers sending lots of requests to the precincts and the infrastructure that the precincts are running on, such that the message that the precinct is trying to send, the tally that it's trying to send to Columbia, cannot get through to Columbia, so it can't be tallied in the central place. But as I said, I think the likelihood of that requires so much preparatory work that while it would, a small glitch could have be leveraged by malicious actors to sow a significant amount of distrust in the outcome of the election. The reality is that the ability for something like that to happen on a significant enough scale to actually impact the outcome, I think, is fairly remote. It's not out of the question, but it would require such a level of scale that really, that's, I think, I don't want to discount their concerns, but I think it's because we are the voting process in the United States is set at local and state level. There are so many different factors that have to come into play and really coalesce at just the perfect amount of time, that the ability to accomplish that in 50 states and territories is, I think, less likely.
We all live in these rectangles now, and that'll shift from the national to the personal. Speak to the issue of cyber hygiene. What are the things that jump out at you? What surprises you about the stuff that people do, which is just not safe?
Sure. So I think one of the things that we talked about in the context of elections, hygiene is something that everyone needs to undertake, from the user up to the organization, up to the government and intergovernmentally. So, and the way that we can have the most impact in encouraging hygiene really needs to come from all sectors. So that is to say, the government could require hygiene among its citizens, whether they're individuals or corporations. That approach has not really succeeded in the United States, except for a certain set of regulated entities. But they can also encourage a bottom-up approach, which is, among other things, starting to teach cybersecurity and cyber hygiene in schools. We're not quite there yet, I think, in the United States. So it's really been left to organizations like the one that I work for to try to make these hygiene practices more common among a variety of user groups. What we've done is to work and identify common and core multi-stakeholder identified best practices from organizations such as the Center for Internet Security. They are similarly shared by some of the governmental security agencies, and worked to identify the resource that most easily accomplishes the objective. So what can a user do to enhance the security of their box? They can, among other things, turn on automatic backups so that all of the work that's been done to create whatever the individual is working on has a backup in the event, for example, that the person becomes the subject of ransomware. We also know that users can use two-factor authentication on their communications accounts, their email accounts, social media, banking. And so we've developed resources to help users identify the best and quickest and easiest path to get to the implementation of these, really in many cases, fewer than 10 steps, 10 actions that in most cases take a very short amount of time to implement.
Google has this toothbrush test where you test the success of a product based on how often you use it without thinking about it. How do you go about seeding cyber hygiene as a habit?
Technology vendors are now really trying to bake security into the product so that it isn't incumbent upon the user to do something to have good security. It's the product arrives at the door with good security built in. But in cases where that is not yet the case, or for devices and applications that are older and predate this kind of movement towards baked-in security, there are still kind of 2 or 3 things that individuals can do, much like they do brush their teeth and they wear their seatbelt, which includes not reusing passwords, generating unique passwords that are long, and to manage all of those long passwords, which no one can remember, using a recognized password management application is one that we recommend. Similarly, using two-factor authentication, so something with something you have. In many cases, we talk now about multi-factor authentication. So my phone has my password, it's already saved through the password manager, but it also has my biometric information. So now we have 2 pieces of information plus my username, which makes it a multi-factor representation of that I am who I say I am. So I'm authenticating to the network in a way that is recognized as acceptable. So those are I think reducing the number of steps that we require or the processes that we put on users is probably the first way that we can really simplify and bring security to them in the areas where we can't just deliver a product that has security built in.
I'd like you to come in on the TikTok issue, of course. So we were talking, Jim Lewis and I, of CSIS. So he was talking about how it's not about TikTok, but it's about the source code that's with ByteDance. I want you to lay that out for us like a flow chart.
The source code that upon which TikTok has been built, being maintained by ByteDance in China, is essentially kind of having the blueprint to the house still in the hands of the architect. So one can change the locks on the doors, but if someone can still crawl in the second story window, they still have access to the house. In this case, one can change attributes potentially of the front end or back end of TikTok, but if someone still knows the entire development cycle for TikTok, they may still be able to undermine some of the steps that have been taken to enhance the security of the application to actually have a deleterious effect or outcome. So the fact is, in my opinion, the source code remaining in the hands, even if they were to transfer the source code to an entity in the United States, it's not clear to me that that reduces the security concerns, because one can make a copy of the code. And unless significant changes are made by the new owner, so to speak, in the United States, it's not clear that the security has actually been increased. So that's where I would say the sort of life cycle and development cycle of TikTok is not remediated. The concerns around that are not remediated, even by transferring the source code to a new entity in the United States, absent a significant amount of review and potentially changes made to the way that the platform is architected. I think the other piece of it that doesn't, perhaps Jim touched on, is we talk a little bit about kind of the mosaic theory of gathering information on people. And I don't know, I can't remember now if Jim also was the victim of the Office of Personnel Management attack. So all of my details as a former employee of the US government who held a security clearance are now in the hands of the person who accessed that data. When you then create the possibility through one platform or another of lots of facial images and other types of markers of individuals, that can give bad actors a greater opportunity to make mischief. And potentially there are concerns around, I think, identity spoofing and the like, which can have long-term effects on both the users themselves, but also confidence really in the use of applications. And we don't want that, right? We think that the internet is the way of the future, but we really need to take more steps to make sure that what's used and created on the internet is legitimate and can't be undermined for negative outcomes.
Great then. I think we've run out the clock. Megan Stifel, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.